Hi, this is Brett from U Programming. Welcome to the Building an Enterprise Application with Java set of tutorials. I was just going to say crash course because we're going to be building the foundations of a layered Java application in 3 tutorials, and we're going to be doing it actually quite fast. Let me show you a summary, what we're going to be touching upon. So like I said, we'll be building an enterprise application with Java. In our first tutorial, we'll be focusing on the layered application architecture and the Spring framework. In the second tutorial, we'll be then building the persistence layer using the DAO or data access object pattern and Hibernate to implement that persistence layer. And in the third tutorial, we'll be actually turning all of this into a web application, and we'll be using Spring MVC to do that. Quickly summarize the first, second, and third tutorial. In our first tutorial, we'll be looking, like I said, we'll be looking at the layered application architecture, Spring. We'll be looking at the layers that make up a layered application. Then we'll be looking at cross-cutting concerns, dependency injection, coding to interfaces. We'll be looking at Apache Maven. We'll be using Apache Maven to create our project and to manage all of our dependencies. So we'll be doing that all within the pom.xml file. Let's have a look at some of the components and concepts that make up this application. Hibernate ORM. Hibernate is a Java library that ORM standing for Object Relational Mapping or Mapper. And it's what we'll be using to actually persist, i.e. read and write objects to and from a backing store, a relational database system. We'll be using the data access object pattern, Spring framework, Spring MVC, and Spring security. So all of these things I just wanted to briefly touch upon. Then we will go and actually configure and wire up our Spring application and test it within a harness, within a test application, that it's all working specifically from the point of view that the Spring context gets loaded, and we can reference beans from that Spring context and instantiate them, or get Spring to instantiate them for us. Right, and in our second tutorial, what we'll then carry on with is the actual implementation of the persistence layer. We'll be using, like I said, we'll be using the DAO pattern. Obviously, we need to define or declare our dependencies in our POM file. So again, we'll be looking at that. Then we'll go on to actually creating our domain entities, our domain managers within the business layer. And then in the data layer, we'll be actually creating the DAO interfaces and the actual implementations. Finally, we'll look at how we need to configure that, how that all gets wired up with Spring. And we'll be touching on things like exceptions, mappings, the data source beans, transaction manager, the session factory, the session manager, stuff like that. And finally, once we've tested that that's all working, that the persistence layer is working with Spring, we will then go on to create a web application, and we'll be using the Spring MVC library to do that. There we obviously have additional dependencies, and once we've listed those dependencies in our pom.xml file, we will then go on to configuring the Spring MVC application. You need to modify or configure all of this in the deployment descriptor, the web.xml file, and the application servlet.xml file. Finally, we will secure our application, and we'll be doing that in the Spring security.xml file. Then we'll create a controller, a model, a template to render that model to the browser. We will then go on to create an artifact, and we'll deploy that artifact to Apache Tomcat. So quite a lot of ground to cover. Let's just go back up. Let's start with this layered application architecture. I have a diagram. There you go. Here you can see what is called the canonical enterprise application architecture. It's about creating these different layers, or dividing your application, the functional application, into different layers. And keep in mind, this is a logical architecture, not a physical architecture. So we will have these different layers, and each layer is supported by the layer directly below it. So we would have a presentation layer. If we're building a web application, obviously the presentation layer is the actual HTML, the web application itself, what gets rendered to the browser and what the user interacts with in their web browser. Then you have a service layer. in these tutorials, we won't actually be implementing the service layer. We will have our presentation layer will be talking straight to the business layer here. And then obviously the business layer itself is supported by a data layer. It's interesting to know that sometimes the data layer is also called an infrastructure layer, and it's called that because it provides infrastructure to the layer. It supports the business layer directly above it with the necessary infrastructure, and that infrastructure is normally networking and databases, stuff like that. Finally, or one other thing that I just want to show you, other than these cross-cutting concerns, is these two different types of services. If you look at this service, our application as a whole will obviously implement a certain set of functionality, and then we will be exposing that functionality to other services. That's what these services are about. They are consuming the functionality that we expose as services. But our application itself also has dependencies. If they're internal dependencies, then they will be satisfied within these layers. But sometimes we will also have to talk to external dependencies. And that's what these services are about. Having an adapter actually, or a data agent, I think they're also called. Just to explain, an adapter or a data agent in this layer is about isolating the idiosyncrasies of talking to these external services that satisfy your dependencies. Right, cross-cutting concerns. Cross-cutting concerns are those aspects of your application that cannot be easily separated from the rest of your application, and also impact all of the different layers and all of the different components to a greater or lesser degree. Security is a prime example of a cross-cutting concern. Logging, caching, transaction management, again, all of these aspects impact all of the different layers to a larger or lesser degree. Right, with that out of the way, I think we need to get on with actually just creating the application, the framework, the project itself. Like I said, I'll be using Maven to do that. I'll then go on to committing this to Git and GitHub. I'll later on push it to GitHub so that you can actually see all of the code and check it out from there. Let me close this and let me close this. I have the IntelliJ IDE up and running. Oh, that's one other thing I just want to discuss before we carry on. There's a set of dependencies that we need to ensure that you have in place so that you can follow along with the tutorial. You need to have Java 7 or 8 installed. You need to have Apache Maven installed, Apache Tomcat, IntelliJ IDE, and it has to be the Enterprise Edition because we'll be using stuff that is specific to the Enterprise Edition, not to the Community Edition, or it's not available in the Community Edition. And you need to have MySQL installed. Right, let me go and create the actual application now, the project. There you go. Let me see where I am. Right. Let me go into desktop, new programming, and let's create that. Right, I have the Maven command to create the project. I have it already in my available to me from my clipboard. You can see here that I'm going to be creating the application or the project with a group ID of com.uprogramming. The artifact ID is going to be enterprise application, and more importantly, I'm going to be using an archetype. Let me see if you pronounce it as archetype or archetype. I'm not sure. Give me a second. Normally you get a little pronunciation. Never mind. I'll be using the Maven archetype quick start to create this actual application. Here we go. It should only take a moment to actually create the project. Let's have a look at that. If I go here now, there we go. You can see that it's created this directory. It has the POM file. This is the Maven POM file in which we'll be listing all of our dependencies. You have a source file, and specifically this main Java com.uprogramming, and then the app, which we'll be using, our harness app that we'll be using to test our Spring configuration, that Spring is correctly configured. And in the second tutorial, we'll be using this app also to check that our persistence layer is wired up correctly. Right, I'm going to commit this to Git. Let's see, am I in the right direction? No, let me go into this application. So let's have a look. I'll create a touch readme.md. This is just a README file that GitHub displays when you browse to a repo. Then I'll create the actual. There, we've created the Git repository. I'll then git add the README to it, and then I'll git commit, and I'll just call this the first commit. There you go. Later on, I'll actually push this to GitHub, and then you can check it out from GitHub. Right, ready to go. Let me go to IntelliJ. Here you go. There's a couple of things that we need to just make sure that are correctly set up in IntelliJ before we start. Let me have a look. Configure. Preferences, specifically Maven. I want to just make sure that Maven is set up correctly. And that is, yes, this home directory. You need to point this to the directory where you've installed Apache Maven on your system. That's fine. And there's one other thing I need to have a look at, are all of the different plugins. This is the Enterprise Edition. It comes with a lot of different plugins, and we will be using quite a few of these plugins whilst developing the application. So let's have a look. What are all of the plugins that we need to have installed? You need to have, let me just browse. There are some plugins there that are already installed, but are not that necessary for what we're doing. You need to have database support plugin installed. Let me carry on going down. Let me see if I can find Hibernate support. Hibernate support has to be installed. All of these Java Enterprise Edition plugins need to be installed. Let's carry on going down. Maven integration plugin needs to be installed. Persistence framework support needs to be installed. Let me see if there are any other ones. I have Spring AOP, the AspectJ plugin needs to be installed. Spring MVC support, Spring Security, Spring support, just the general Spring support plugin needs to be installed as well. And let me see what else. I think Tomcat plugin, and that's it. Yes, just make sure that before you start building the application or following along with these tutorials, once you've installed the IntelliJ IDE, that you have these plugins installed. Right, now we are ready to go. I'm now going to import the project that I've just created, the project that we just created with Maven. So I'll go to import project. It asks me where, desktop U programming enterprise application. It's in the right place already. Import project from external model. Yes, we're using We're using Maven, not Gradle. So I click on Maven. As far as I'm aware, all of this is correct. We click on next. Select Maven projects to import. Yes, this is fine. Next. I'll be using Java 1.7, so this is fine. Even though it's listing Android and Android 15 and whatnot, don't worry about that. That's not relevant to this tutorial. Next. Project name, enterprise application, and project file location. That's all fine. And finish. What it should do now is actually open up the IDE, close down these tips, and we're ready to go. Let me see, you have your project structure on the left here, and yes, so we can see the same. There we go. And I can click on that. Excellent. I'm just going to run this application, create a run configuration, run this application, this little default application, just to make sure that everything is working. On first startup, it does this indexing, and you can see the progress here. So I can hear my hard disk really churning along there. Right, once that's done, I'm going to actually create, like I said, a run configuration. You go to this run menu here, click on run, and just choose app, the name of the class that we want to run. And it should just output hello world to the console. And this is just to check that everything's up and running and working correctly. Add files to Git. I'll click on OK. And there we got hello world. Excellent. So if I change this and rerun, it should all be okay. Hello. Hi. How are you? Save that and then just rerun. And I should see that. Excellent. So this is all working. Right. The first thing I want to focus on now is actually the pom.xml file. I hope my battery lasts for the duration of this tutorial. So I want to focus on this pom file. You can see that the IDE is already saying, look, you need to import changes. I'll click on that, but there's going to be many more that we're going to be enumerating here, listing here the dependencies. So I have created a file, with all of our, I'm just going to copy and paste this and paste that in there. Let's have a look. Right, and again you can see that the IDE is saying you need to re-import all of the changes. Let's have a quick look at this. You can see the group ID, the artifact ID, the packaging, it's going to be a jar, the version, the name, programming laid enterprise application, URL is not relevant at the moment. Then I've defined some properties here. The most important thing, other than this source encoding UTF-8, are the different version of the dependencies that I want to use. So you can see I've said I've defined a Spring Framework .version variable, which I'll be referencing later on in my dependencies here. And I've done the same here for Spring Security, JUnit, the JDK version, the Hibernate core, and the MySQL connector. And you can see here I've actually this is the plugin, not too important. The important thing here now is all of these dependencies. So let's just have a look. Quite a few dependencies, but the important ones are basically Spring. And again, you can see here I'm referencing the appropriate version from my properties up here. So Spring, the Spring core, Spring Context, Spring Aspects, Spring ORM or ORM, Spring Web MVC, Spring Security Web, Spring Security Config, Hibernate, MySQL, Servlet API, Servlet GSTL, that's specifically for our templating. And then I think we have here some loggers. Yes, all of the different loggers that we can use. Right, I'm going to save that and I'm going to do import changes. And let's, yes, let's take the language effect into account. And you can see here, that went very quick. What I also normally do is I just go to the terminal lists, make sure, yes, there you have, and I do an nvm clean install. And then basically the same as what the IDE has just done for us, but we'll be actually seeing it in the terminal. There you go. There you go. Yeah, everything looking good. So we're ready to go. Right, now that we've got that out of the way, I'm actually going to start creating. If I go here, let's open up that. I'm actually going to be creating I'm going to create a resources directory. That's where we'll be putting our Spring configuration files. So let me just create a resources. Putting it here, it's also straight away on the class path, right? So resources, I'll create a spring.xml. This is where we'll be putting our, yes, let's add that to Git. That's where we'll be creating our initial Spring configuration. And now I'll also start creating our Java package structure. And if you remember, oh, sorry, I want to show you this. I'm actually going to be creating each one of these layers will go into its own package. So there will be a UI package, there'll be a service package, there'll be a business package, and there'll be a data package. So let's get going. com.uprogramming.ui. There you go. Package. Then we will go to com.uprogramming.service. Even though we won't be touching upon this layer in the tutorial, I will already create the package. com.uprogramming.business, and I'm going to copy that because I need to make some sub packages. And the final one, which is data, com.uprogramming.data, and then some sub packages. So there was business, and then I'll be creating domain. This is where we'll be putting our business entities and our business logic, which goes into managers. Business logic managers. Bit of a misnomer. Never mind. Managers. No, sorry. I'm going to actually change that to, let me see, refactor to manager. There you go. Refactor. There you go. And finally, I need to create this one as well. So package com.uprogramming.data.dao, and that's where we'll be putting everything related to our persistence layer. Right, so we have business, com.uprogramming business, com.uprogramming data, com.uprogramming service, and UI. And obviously within business we have domain and manager, and within data initially we just have the DAO subpackage. Right, I'm going to actually create in this domain, I'm going to create a tester domain entity, which I'll then be wiring up in the Spring .xml file and to check that Spring is correctly configured. So let's create a tester. There you go. Yes, let's add that to Git. Right, here we go. Private string name, and then we will have a couple of public string get name, return name, and a setter public void. I could actually get IntelliJ to create these getters and setters for me, and when I'm implementing other classes, I'll actually do that. Public void set name, and then we'll pass in string name. Oops, sorry. There you go. And this name equals name, and then public void test system out, and then we'll do test, and then we will do name plus, and then we will close that. Let me just see if that's correct. Test plus name. Yeah, that's good. Right, this is a bean that I'm going to wire up now in our Spring config, and then in our app here, I'm going to be creating an application context and referencing or getting Spring to instantiate this bean for us automatically. And this is just again to test that the Spring application is correctly set up and wired up as it should be. So let's go to the spring.xml. I have that already, so that you don't just watch me typing endlessly, but I will explain it to you. and I'll delete that. We don't need that yet. That will come when we have defined our other layers. Right, Spring, the usual stuff, namespaces, whatnot, locators, schema locators. Just make sure that you're referencing the right one. I've had some problems in the past when by mistake I wasn't referencing the right schema. Just make sure you're referencing the right one, like I said. This enable auto wiring, this context annotation config. Initially we're not using it, but at a later date we will be using it, and I'll come back to this. Then we declare some beans. Here I'm actually declaring a bean. I'm saying which class. You can actually see that within the spring.xml file we have kind of like code completion, so you can com uprogramming.business.domain.tester. So here I'm actually telling the Spring, in the Spring configuration, I'm actually saying I want this, this specific Java class made available to me within the Spring context. I give it an ID. This is important because I'll be using this ID to actually reference this, this bean. And then here I'm doing what's called property injection. If you remember correctly, let me just save this. You can see that I've defined a property with the name, and then here I'm actually referencing that property and I'm assigning it a value. And we will see that it outputs this value. And you can see then when I'll make a change to this value and rerun the application, and you'll see it actually changing without any changes in the code. Right, let me just get that one to there. So let's get back here. Right, this we can remove. And now I'll start actually creating, I don't like that. I'll need to configure my IDE not to do that kind of code formatting. Right, let's go. I need an application context. Application context, yes. By adding this type to my application, the IntelliJ IDE automatically imports or adds the necessary import. Application context, I'll just call it context. There you go. And then here I'll do something along the lines of app equals new app, and then app.execute. And I'll define this method now. Public void execute. There you go. Here I'm saying context, and I'm actually assigning a value to the context. Context equals new class path XML application context. That is, if I remember correctly, the right one. And then I need to actually reference the appropriate Spring file that I'm going to be using to define the application context. Now, if everything is correct, I can do something along these lines. Class path, and I can say spring.xml. And it should find this spring.xml file on the class path. And then test to check that Spring is wired up correctly. There you go. Tester. Let me just import this. I just do an alt. There you go. And it's been automatically now imported. Context.getBean, and we get the bean by its ID. And if you remember correctly, I called this bean tester. And that's referring to this bean here with the ID of tester. And then I have this bean, and I can do now tester.test. In theory, If everything is set up correctly, everything is wired up correctly, this should run, and we will get on the console, we will have something output along the lines of, test, and then whatever we've injected, Mr. Tester. So let me just build that, rebuild the project, just make sure that I don't get any errors there. It should all be fine, and I should now be able to run this very small little test application, this test harness, and there you can see test Mr. Tester. Now I'm actually going to make a change to our spring.xml file and rerun the application, and you'll see that this is changed. Whatever I change in the spring.xml file will change as well. And I'm actually injecting this value by means of property injection into the test object, this tester object. So I'm going to change that here. Testing that it is all working. Save that and then rerun the application. And there you go, testing that it is all working. This just confirms to me that Spring is correctly set up. We have all of the appropriate libraries. You can see here, let me just close that. All of the appropriate libraries have been pulled in by Maven. You can see all of the different libraries here. And Spring is working. It's found the spring.xml file on the class path. And we're basically ready to go. In our next tutorial, what we'll be discussing is, like I said, actually implementing the persistence layer, which corresponds to the data layer, the business and the data layer. I just want to show you that one more time. So basically, yes, next tutorial we'll be focusing on business logic, business entities, and the data access components. It's going to be quite a long tutorial. I don't know how long this one has taken, but the next one we've got even more ground to cover. There's a lot of things that you just need to be aware of how to wire them all up correctly. Right, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. And I hope to see you around for the next tutorial. Thank you and goodbye.